Welcome back to She Talks Green, where we dive into the most pressing environmental issues of our time, break down complex policies, and explore real solutions with the experts leading the way. Today's episode is one that every Indian citizen should tune into because it's about something that affects us all: our environmental laws, and our right to clean air, water, and a healthy planet. To help us unpack all of this, we have with us Serene Osho, Director of the India Program at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. She is a legal expert and an environmental policy advocate who has spent years analyzing how laws can drive real impact in climate action. Zareen, welcome to She Talks Green. Let's dive right in.
Thank you so much, Arpita, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on the show with you today.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with a Netflix series that I watched recently, and that made me think, where are we heading, or are we actually there? There's a Netflix series, Leila, where it imagines a future where the rich are living in climate controlled enclaves while the rest suffer from extreme heat, water scarcity, and environmental collapse. With rising urban heat, widening gaps in access to clean air and water due to climate change, and the unequal impact of this extreme weather, do you think are we already on this path? And also, given the widening social divide and the increasing conflicts across the world, do you think India's environmental laws and policies are strong enough to address these disparities?
Thank you for that question, Arpita. And I think it reminds me of my reaction to one of the episodes of Black Mirror, where China had gone into, putting a social score on everybody. And, a few years later, I found out they actually do that. So Leila is one of those Netflix shows that reminds me of a future that is not too far. It's not dystopia. It's not something in the future. It's, if you think of it, it's kind of happening, right? Like in our very small own bubble, people who can afford it, they tend to live in air conditioned rooms and buildings. There are now, more and more technologies out there for the rich, or for the people who can afford it more generally, that protect you from the external environment. That there is also this point of mobility. I live in Delhi. I have the means to, actually consider moving outside of Delhi because the pollution is so bad here, and I can afford to leave Delhi and move elsewhere, right? So something very similar to the show, where people who are able to afford it and are able to do those changes or make those changes in their life, they're certainly able to. But for the poorest of the poor, who've basically left behind their villages and, the gowns that they've come from into bigger cities with the hope of finding better livelihoods and lives, they do not have the same opportunity as you and I do. And so I believe, to answer your question in short, Leila is not dystopia. It's very much the beginning of the reality that we today live in. And a very simple example of that would be just the heat stress in India. So every, consecutive summer that we see, um, when I was a child, 30 years ago, um, I was able to go out in the summer months and play with my friends. Today, with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees centigrade here in Delhi, you can't afford to have children go out and play in the middle of the day outside in a park. Another exceedingly interesting development that has taken place since you and I were kids were that during our time in school, classrooms did not need to be air conditioned. I do not remember an air conditioned classroom. Today, your leading schools in bigger cities in across the country have air conditioned buses in schools because it is just unbearable for somebody to study in those classrooms. And as a direct impact of that rising heat stress, you see that the productivity in the country has gone down. You see that the kids who are in classrooms are not able to concentrate, how do you, like, if it's 50 degrees centigrade, how do you expect kids to sit down and be like, yeah, I'm going to take this lesson in math and science and I'm going to do so and so. So yeah, Leila is not the dystopian future. Leila is very much the reality of India, and in some parts, maybe not to the extent as depicted in the show, which I will not be surprised that in our lifetimes that happens. But as shown in the show, I don't think that there is anything ridiculous about the show. I think very much the reality of where we are, and we're starting to scratch that way ahead.
True, I think I completely agree with you. But having said that, I also believe to be optimistic that collectively we will be able to address these. And that brings me to the second part of the question, that do you think India's environmental laws and policies as we stand today are strong enough to address these disparities? Are we having enough conversation around this to not actually move towards this reality?
So that's a great question, and it's a very wide and open-ended question, right? And before I actually get to the meat of the matter, I think it's very important to sort of set the context in which this question is being asked. As far as the quantity of laws concerned, we have enough. There is no dearth of law in India. We have the world's largest constitution. Every department, every ministry has guidelines, bylaws. You have CPCB, SPCB. As far as the institutional structure is concerned, there is no dearth. And even since the Bhopal gas tragedy, for example, India's environmental protection laws have taken a certain shape, they've taken a certain form, and we've seen legislation over the years be developed further. The question is, while you have law, who is able to access that law? That's the first question. The second question is, how good are we as an institutional, how much of an institutional capacity do we have to enforce that law? So, who is accessing those laws? Who enforces it? And where is the political will? And the political will question goes directly hand in hand with the laws in the country, because it's ultimately the parliament and that representation of the bodies of people that we have sent to the parliament that directly develop law. It's the parliament that creates law, passes a bill that eventually becomes law, or the court does it. Now, I think as far as the question that you originally asked, do we have enough laws in India to tackle with the problem? Yes, enough and more than what we need, to be honest. The the not so great part of the story, or the pitfalls, come from those three other factors that I spoke of. We do not know how to access those laws. There may or may not be political will to build a clean environment, a safe environment for all, and for various reasons, not to point fingers at one entity or one individual or one government. While the question that you asked was, if do we have enough laws to begin with? Yes, absolutely. But I think the part that the government of India or we as a country fail, or are not necessarily the strongest, are on the three other parameters, which is on who accesses the law, or how many people actually know that they have a right to access those courts for those matters. The second is our enforcement. Who enforces the law? So I can be a judge sitting in the Supreme Court. I could be the Chief Justice of India, the highest court. Um, but ultimately, it's not me who goes on ground to enforce that, right? Somebody else has to do that for me. The dispensation of that judgment has to be taken forward. And then the last one is political will, the parliament. So we have sent a bodies of persons to the parliament, and the parliament is ultimately the body that is responsible for creating new legislation, new bills, which eventually get passed in the lower and the upper house of the parliament and become law as we know it. And the other, of course, is the courts. Now, across these three parameters of accessibility, enforcement, and lawmaking, those three are the areas of law where, or the areas surrounding law, or law adjacent, is where we have, I think, the bulk of our problem. Um, you could question if lawmakers in the parliament, if you go and ask a member of parliament tomorrow, even privately, not just publicly, would you like us to have clean air, clean water, clean environment? The answer is never going to be no. It is the system as a whole that we know that fails that MP or fails the government as a whole, because environmental cleaning is done on such a long term scale that if I am today fighting for a 5 year period to come back to power, it does not make sense for me technically in the in the given system to put my resources for a cleaner environment. Accessibility. If I am someone, who are the people in the country who have the worst environment that they can live in? It's actually the people who live in and around garbage dumps, landfills of India. So let's talk about Delhi, Gazipur. There were fires that happened in the Gazipur landfill. And why would that happen? That happened because the methane gas that was being emitted from the rotting refuse in the landfill caught fire during summer months because the temperatures were above 50 degrees centigrade. It is the rat pickers in and around that landfill who need the access to the law most. It is not people like you and I who are in other comfortable areas of Delhi. Do those people have access to law? No. Technically, the law says that you have the access because we have Article 14 that says equality of law and equality before law, before courts. But the access to that equality in itself is a challenge. And the next one is enforcement. When you look at enforcement in India, to give you an example, we had the former environment minister of Delhi, Gopal Rai, congratulate this past Diwali of 2024 the citizens of Delhi, saying that it has been a revolutionary year where we had a ban on firecrackers and nobody burst firecrackers and so on and so forth. Now, I live in South Delhi, which has far lesser population density compared to, say, a North Delhi or an East Delhi or a West Delhi. And I can tell you that here in South Delhi itself, the firecrackers went on from 3 days before Diwali until 2 days after Diwali, absolutely zero enforcement. So, when we talk about enforcement, what is enforcement? Who is enforcing? Who is responsible for that enforcement? Can I go and hold a particular officer responsible that, in South Delhi, the firecrackers were being burst? Where were you? Why have you not enforced the ban? I can't do it. I don't know who to go to. So, accessibility, enforcement, and will, political will, are the three areas of law or three areas of law adjacent that we are very weak on. As far as the legal compendiums are concerned in India, with regard to the Environment Protection Act, the Air Pollution Preventative Act, the multiple constitutional articles, and so on and so forth, there is no dearth of law. The problem is across those three.
No, I think you made a very fair point about enforcement. I do feel that we have enough laws. I don't think that is the problem. The enforcement, the political will for sure, it's something that we need to question. And just going back to the example that you gave, firecrackers. I think enforcement, one of course, is from the elected government and the authorities, but the second part to that is also awareness. And that sort of reflects how fragmented our society is now becoming, because the minute you start requesting people that it is as it is 500 above AQI, we are not saying crackers, or we are not trying to give it a religious color, but we are saying is that if you're going to burst crackers in 500 AQI, it is only going to add to the problem. Had we been in 100 below AQI, go ahead, burst some crackers, it's fine. We do that across the world during New Year's and Christmas, maybe, I don't know. But the point is really that in the political sort of playground, everything becomes a political discussion, and different kind of colors is given to it. But as you truly said, that who is the most impacted? It's not probably you and I, because we can afford certain comforts and still take care of us. Yes, it's a people living, without these amenities. So certainly, I think that is something we need to closely take a look at. And of course, in the discussion, we'll get to some of those laws, uh, some of the tools that we can help citizens be aware of, and can be used. Coming to something interesting, I read about the rights of nature. It's a movement that has gained traction in some parts of the world. Countries like Bolivia or Ecuador have granted legal rights to nature in their constitution to protect indigenous lands and livelihoods from industrial activities and whatnot. Even in Costa Rica, I think bees, trees, and natural plants have been granted citizenship to incorporate urban biodiversity into the city design. Can you tell us about the right of nature movement? And I mean, I'm very curious that can India extend similar rights to nature here under its constitutional protection um articles like 21, which is right to life, and 48A, environmental protection? Can we do something like that in India as well? And more than that, is that going to help?
Yeah, so this was actually something like you've rightly pointed out. Many countries around the world, many jurisdictions and legal systems around the world have adopted this right to nature in a different legal form, depending on whatever legal systems those countries follow. Um, some aspects of right to nature have been adopted by those countries that you just listed. This is in the Indian form of it, of right to nature, and the discussions, legal discussions that have thus far prompted the discourse and the dialogue around this issue has basically come from judge made law. So law can be made, broadly speaking, in simplistic terms, in two forms. One is through the parliament. There is an act that is made by the parliament passes it, goes through the lower house, goes through the upper house, president signs on it, becomes law. That's the simple sort of route of legislative processes to creating of an act of a law of the land. The other is called judge made law, simply put, which is basically that a case has come before a court, and the judge looks at the case and finds that this particular thing that has this particular issue that has been brought before the court um, requires a certain interpretation of law, and then that interpretation of law becomes as a part of the judgment, the law of the land, because the judge is passing a judgment, and when a judge passes a judgment, it is the law of the land. Something similar happened in the right of the nature case, and it was brought before the Madras High Court in 2022, where it was requested to the court to consider that the court determine natural resources of the state as a legal person. What that means is you and I are people, individuals who are citizens of India. Each one of us have certain rights and duties. So my right is that nobody in India can kill me. I have a right to life. But it is also my duty that I do not kill another. So there is this equilibrium maintained by the constitution, which is allowed to everybody. And right to life is something that is not just allowed to citizens of India, but any person in India. So, for example, a foreigner comes to India, we do not have the right to kill it or kill them. Uh, Similarly, when the court was made a request to look into, right to nature as a concept, and this has happened not just in Madras High Court, it has happened across several other high courts, Uttarakhand being one, Punjab and Haryana being the other. Where in the Uttarakhand High Court, the judgment passed by the High Court in Uttarakhand was that they determined the rivers of Ganga and Yamuna to be legal persons with rights and duties. Similarly, Punjab and Haryana High Court said the Sukhna Lake in Chandigarh is going to be a legal personality with rights and duties, right? The idea or the concept behind doing that was to essentially protect these natural resources or bodies or animals. In fact, there was another court case. It was a PIL filed by the PCO. It's a charitable organization in the Supreme Court, um, wanting the Supreme Court to grant a legal status to all animals across India, right? So right to nature has featured in the Indian legal system in one form or the other. The problem with the interpretation adopted by the Uttarakhand High Court, for example, in the Ganga Yamuna case, was that when you give a river rights and duties, and let's go back to the original the proposition that I gave to you, right? I have the fundamental right to not be killed, and I also have the fundamental duty to not kill. When you do the same application of law to an animal, to a river in the Uttarakhand High Court case, then you also open a can of worms in the sense of litigations that follow. Meaning, tomorrow, if the Ganga or the Yamuna flood, or if a bear attacks me and kills me, do I have the right to go and sue the Ganga, Yamuna, and the bear? No. Who enforces it? So, as far as the right part is that you have a right to exist, it's all good. But when it comes to duties, that is where there is complication on law. So you cannot simply say that I, Zerin Osho, and Ganga, the river, have the same rights and duties. It's not possible because who enforces it? Who's the guardian of it? If tomorrow the Ganga swells up, floods, and kills people, who do you sue? You can't sue the river. So you have to sue an entity. Who is the entity?
I mean, it is reminding me of a movie called Oh My God,
Correct.
where Paresh Rawal, yeah,
That's exactly
exactly.
that's exactly it. Do you sue God? That is the
Interesting.
interpretation of law, and basis this, the judgment was struck down by the Supreme Court because it says you can give the right to exist. In fact, a more appropriate interpretation of law, in my personal opinion, would be the right to exist or right to healthy coexistence rather than the right to a legal status as you and I. Arpita and Zerin is not equal to Ganga and Yamuna. They have a different status and a different interpretation of law. So, and we do not really understand why so many, I personally do not understand why so many courts in the country, high courts in the country, like Punjab and Haryana being the other court, has looked at um, these natural bodies or animals with the same lens as they would apply to you and I, because the problem that the Supreme Court highlighted when it struck down this judgment was exactly the one that I explained. Who enforces it? Who do you hold accountable? And does this mean that you can file a case against River Ganga and Yamuna? No, no. So that's the right of nature discussion in India, which is why I said that different forms of right to nature have been adopted in India at the national level, at the Supreme Court, because that is the court of the land. So
Yeah.
whatever the High Court say has binding value, meaning that if I were to cite a judgment in another state, let's say Gujarat, I could say that the Punjab and Haryana High Court or the Uttarakhand High Court had adjudicated so and so judgment. Obviously, I can't say that anymore because the Supreme Court overturned that. But let's say it hadn't been overturned by the Supreme Court, then that particular judgment has a very strong binding or it has a very strong persuasive argument that I can make before a Gujarat High Court. Does that mean that that is the law of the land? No, it becomes the law of the land when the Supreme Court says it, which the Supreme Court didn't. So, at the national level, as far as India is concerned as a whole, this particular aspect of law is unsettled. Then the other point that you asked me was about Article 48A, which
Yeah.
talks about the state of India or the government of India is going to strive to have cleaner environment and so on and so forth. I do not remember the article in verbatim, but that particular aspect of the Indian Constitution falls under a category called DPSP, which is Directive Principle of State Policy. That is not enforceable, that is not binding. What
Okay.
that means is that that is a general ideal that India as a country should strive for. So, for example, the most common and the most well known example of DPSP in India, Directive Principle of State Policy in India, is the liquor ban. So,
Mm.
one of the DPSPs in the constitution says that India will strive to be an alcohol free country. Now, I'm a Punjabi. Try to go say this to people in Punjab that we're going to take alcohol away. Not going to fly. But it does fly in Gujarat,
Yeah.
right? So, it's a ideal. We would like to be great people. We would like to strive for righteousness. We would like to strive for justice. We want to, but are we? Long way to go. So what is going to happen as a result of 48A is you can't enforce it. You can't sue anybody because it says 48A says that you were supposed to give me clean air and you haven't, so I'm going to sue you. Doesn't work like that.
Interesting. In my mind, I'm just thinking then, is this even successful, or is this more and coming back to some examples that you just quoted, like the river Ganga or Yamuna, while they have same legal rights probably, but what good it has done, because particularly Yamuna, we've seen many stories showing the toxic water, the foaming. It's a disaster. And interestingly, now that we have a new government in Delhi, the Yamuna cleaning project is also back in the spotlight. So I'm just trying to be real here, that and understanding from you, that is this then all just a political grandstanding, or is there a way to review this initiative and maybe make it more stronger to enforce real action, so that we can actually clean our rivers and ensure that people have access to better water, because it's a health hazard?
You've asked the golden question that I think people have been trying to answer for almost 100 years of the Indian independence, I believe, at this point. So, the short answer to your question is yes and no. Both of them are true, right? Again, it's all about the context in which you operate. So, just before the Delhi election, there was a tussle between the opposition and the central government. The state government here in Delhi was in opposition to the central government in India, and Yamuna became a political issue where one political party said that Yamuna is a dying river, it is the most toxic river, so on and so forth, explaining what they thought the Yamuna's current situation was, which I tend to scientifically agree with. And you had the same old government come back in response and say the who's who live in Delhi. It is the political, the seat of power in India here in Delhi. It is where the prime minister is, it is where the chief justice of India is, it is where the Supreme Court is, this is where the political corridors of India are. So is the Yamuna water just bad for the chief minister of Delhi, or is it bad for everybody else who's much higher in rank compared to the CM of Delhi? So that answer is telling you something about political will in India, right? It tells you about the fact that we as a country, when we do not want to give straight up answers, or when we do not wish to be accountable for actions that are leading up to a certain situation here today in 2025, what's the date today? 23rd February 2025, let's say. Then we twist it. And we twist it in a way to completely deflect the answer and make a non issue an issue, which is what happened in this situation, right? Similarly, you spoke about religion and law. It is the dichotomy of centuries. We, as we have adopted currently in India, the constitution, the law, it is a colonial past that we have adopted. So the concept of state and law was not true for India before the British came to India. It is a Western colonial concept that was integrated in law. What did we do when we became an independent country of India? We said we have a secular constitution. The state, which is the government, and the church, which is the religion, are not intertwined. Now, this is not true for Western democracies, United States. The church and the state are together. In India, technically, that is not true because we are a secular country. Now, because we are a secular country and we are a secular constitution, the constitution also allows for religious freedoms. And the religious freedoms is taken very seriously in India because we are a very God fearing, God loving nation across all religions that are practiced and followed in this country, which say under the articles of the Indian constitution as fundamental right, every person in India will be allowed to follow his or her religion, right? Equality. Again, intertwined very closely with secularism because there is no state law. Everybody is allowed to follow whatever religion they believe in, and everybody is allowed to preach their religion. Now, what happens is the problem comes when two fundamental rights are pitted against one another, which is what happens in India. So, while there is a fundamental right to profess, preach, and practice religion, there is also a fundamental right to life, which is where your clean environment, clean air, clean this, clean that is all, under law, under interpretation. So this is the multiple MC Mehta versus Union of India judgments. All have implications for Article 21 right to life, which is all encompassing, that says everything that requires for a healthy human life, human and animal life, is under Article 21. So in this particular case, you have two rights being pitted against one another. Now, another DPSP, Directive Principle of State Policy in India, is the encouragement of scientific temper, which says that India as a country will strive to be logical, be scientific in its temper, be scientific in its nature. This was added when, Sati Pratha, for example, was practiced, that women were expected to sit on the fire, the pyre of their dead husbands, as the practice of being all devotional to their marriages and husbands, right? So scientific temper was brought in to say this is wrong. Now, similarly, these are all contrasting realities of India. We are the country that produces the most technical, smartest brains in the world, and we also used to be a country that used to practice Sati Pratha. Now, I'm sure you've been following the news about Mahakumbh. The CPCB has gone and sent in a detailed report about the quality of water of the river. They call it a dead river. There is fecal matter. And, the likes of and the who's who in the country have gone to take a dip in fecal matter water. Now, you can't stop them. It is also your religious rights. I was born to Hindu parents. It is also my religious right that if somebody in my family has passed away, and if I do not have the means to, cremate them, you let the body be taken by River Ganga, right? These complexities and these contrasting realities exist in India. So the problem is the role of the government is the thing that is going to be the deadlock, the deadlock breaker rather, in these situations, which is, does our government do enough to promote scientific temper in situations where religion is pitted against right to environment? I think the answer is publicly known. That is the role the government should be playing. The role the government should be not is not to say to discourage people from going to the river Ganga to pray and to do arti, but it should also at the same time say that consuming water that is infested is not healthy, just that much, and let people make their own choices. Despite that, if people want to do what they want to do, it is their fundamental right to do so. So I think that is the the reality of India. It is competing and contradictory nuances that are all together. They exist together.
I think I can only respond by saying that how, because we will keep discussing, but the how part, and I know the how part has many answers that actually can be taken care of. It's a long fight, and one can only hope
It's an
that we reach there.
intergenerational fight.
Yes,
And
it
it is the
is.
fight that people must realize that they have inherited their earth, this environment from their ancestors as a loan that they're owed to the next generation. It is not your
Absolutely.
right, it is a debt you carry.
Absolutely. Before I get into some more India specific events that have led to shifts in or amendments in our existing laws and regulations, I'm just going to touch upon a little bit on the global perspective. Given that climate change doesn't know any boundaries, right? So, laws and policies in this case bring a host of complexities. For instance, the Arctic Circle influences the Earth's climatic ecosystem, and it is also geopolitically contested. India, like many other nations, has an Arctic policy along with a plethora of national missions. India's Arctic policy recognizes the direct link between the ice loss and the destabilization of the Indian summer monsoons, which potentially threatens our food security and hence the economy. Yet, this particular issue rarely features in India's mainstream climate discourse. Now, given that the Arctic Sea ice law could accelerate extreme monsoon events, should we be treating this Arctic protection as an urgent national priority? And how India can leverage global climate diplomacy to push for stronger Arctic conservation efforts?
That's a very interesting question, Arpita. And yes, so to explain very simply, what happens is, so there was a Svalbard treaty that was signed before India became an independent country. And on behalf of what India is today, the British government signed and ratified this treaty for India. And then post 1947, we went into something like an automatic ratification of the treaty. Now, it is a completely different discussion altogether if we should have ratified that treaty. And what the treaty did was to basically recognize that there are 8 Arctic states, and those 8 Arctic states are determined on the basis of their territorial jurisdiction, which basically means um, if I am a country that is close to the Arctic, then I have a right to the Arctic, and only those countries that surround the North Pole on the top of the earth, that are 8 of those countries, they are the only countries that have rights and obligations of that area, right? Now, back in the time, back when this um, you know treaty was signed and this agreement came to be and was enforced, there was very little climate science that existed the way we know it today. So, to give you an example, India, which is closer to the tropics, could not have realistically said we have anything to do with the North Pole. Why would we? Because if we look at the world map, it's counterintuitive. Why should we have anything to do? The people are not the same, the culture is not the same, the food's not the same, the climatic conditions are not the same. Nothing is similar to the Arctic, right? But as time passed, and the science, climate science evolved, what we figured out was that there are these geophysical concepts called the teleconnections. So teleconnection is a scientific principle which states that if X happens, Y will happen. Very simply put. And what we know today is that there are teleconnections between all of planet Earth. Like there are these sort of, it's like a feedback loop. The input from one will lead to the output of another, will lead to the input of the third, and an entire system of the Earth as we know it functions, right? Now, the Arctic is a very interesting function of the Earth. Essentially, to think of it like if we call the Amazon forest the lung of the Earth, the Arctic is like the nervous system or the brain of the Earth. And it has been preserved over millions of years since the time Earth as a planet was being evolved. And it has gone through different ages, the ice age, whatever age, bronze age, so on and so forth. And over the years, because of its temperature and the tilt of the Earth, it has preserved within its layers of ice so much carbon dioxide and other gases that if they were to be released today, they will be equal to 25 years of the current business as usual scenario emissions of the world. That's the amount of gases, greenhouse gases, that ice stores. So, what happens is because climate is warming and the Arctic is warming 4 times that of any other average of the planet, the impact of global warming and climate change is the highest in the Arctic. It is the most eco sensitive zone. And because it is warming 4 times that of the average global warming rate anywhere else in the world, it is also deteriorating the fastest. And because it is deteriorating the fastest, it completely changes the functions of the earth as we know it. So, let's go back to Science 101. Heat always goes up, cold air, cold water comes in its place, right? And because this is happening continuously, this is what causes rainfall. This is what causes ocean currents. Ocean currents, when they do this over all the oceans of the worlds, right? They cause rainfall all over the world. They also change temperature all over the world. So, this one aspect of the North Pole being very cold, and imagine all of the world's oceans are being heated because they go to India, they go to the equator, they go south, then they go up. So there is this continuous change of water circulation. The water all around the world travels. And at some point, it will go to the Arctic and to the Antarctic, the poles, to cool. Because the South Pole and the North Pole are the two places of the Earth where it becomes very cold. So, in order to make this happen, they have to go to these two parts. So, the circulation occurs. And when this circulation occurs, your land temperatures are going to go down because colder air is coming into your shores. Rainfall will be caused. Different, wind aspects are going to change, so on and so forth. This entire cycle is being disrupted. And that is what teleconnection is. So when this cycle gets disrupted, it causes other disruptions. These disruptions together that are caused by X is loss of Arctic sea ice. Disruption causing change of monsoons, Y. So when X is caused, Y will happen. That is teleconnection. So when in any given year, now we have science that is far more advanced, now in 2025 than it was in the 1930s, 1940s, and the 1920s when Svalbard was signed. And this is still not mainstream science. This is very specialized science, and we are just starting to scratch the surface of it, which is why, the question that you asked, why is this not being spoken of? Because there are literally like 12 people in the country who know this. And there are other challenges also that I will speak about. So, this is not mainstream science. This is extremely specialized science that requires advanced modeling, that requires so much more infrastructure that you have to constantly go and monitor, the Arctic. at all given points in a year, and you have to do it continuously over years to be able to collect that data in order to draw inferences, right? Now, what happens is, what we have thus far learned is that in any given year you look at, there are summer months. In the summer months, when the Arctic ice is the thinnest or non-existent because बहुत गर्मी हो गई, so there is no ice. That is the time that India records extreme weather events. It shifts the Indian summer monsoon. Now think of it. We never were able to make this connection with the Arctic a few years ago. Now we have. So, when we have now made this connection with the Arctic, what do we now know about the Arctic? It directly impacts internal security of India. About 60 to 70%, depending on census and what report you study, about 60 to 70% of India, which is 1.47 billion people, depend directly or indirectly on rain-fed monsoons, on agriculture as a whole, as a sector. Agriculture contributes about 14 to 16% to the Indian GDP. So changes in Indian summer monsoon mean riots ho jayenge. Food security is up in the air, and food security not just for India, for global. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was no supply of wheat in the international food commodities market, India stopped exports to protect domestic pricing. The world came on down on its knee. So in a globalized world, when you also change your suppliers and consumers, there are huge implications for the world. So if tomorrow things go vary and India needs to protect its domestic market, which it ought to, it should, then goodbye, take care to the rest of the world. We are not going to export food when our people are going to die of hunger. So, teleconnections is a very important internal security question. Now, coming to India's role in this, India launched a Arctic policy about a couple of years ago in 2023. It is the first step in it's the first step in India's diplomatic recognition of Arctic as a region. And Arctic is like the lamb of Indian foreign policy. It's a baby. We are nowhere close to being anywhere near where China has, where it's sort of gotten called a near Arctic state. It has developed the polar Silk Route, so on and so forth. We are nowhere close to that, but it's the step in the right direction. We are now the only global south country in the world to have a 24/7, 365 days per year monitoring station in the Arctic. We are the only global south country in the world to have it. We are also perhaps the only global south country in the world to have data on the Arctic. And when I say the only global south country in the world, I don't know if China is included in that definition anymore. But we are at least able to tell the world that we know that there is a connection between Arctic sea ice loss and monsoon. If we were to do these studies for Africa, or if you were to Google search this for Africa, you will not find that data. So Indian scientists have that. So we are slightly better off. Now, even if we are better off, what good does that make? Because we are not members to something called as the Arctic Council. We are observers to it. There are 8 member countries to the Arctic Council, 7 of which are NATO members or in the process of becoming a NATO country, versus the 8th, which is Russia. And obviously, these two don't get along. When they don't get along, and Russia owns about 60 to 70% of the Arctic. So all the decision making then is done twofold. There are two gangs, so to say, that you have to work with, right? The Russians and the NATO plus allies. This is where everything gets lost in translation, because there is so much tension because of the world politics and the wars that are happening globally. Arctic and what it means to the rest of the world is completely lost. So India, even though we might know that, Arctic loss is causing changes in the Indian monsoons, we don't know very much what to do with it, because it has to be done either bilaterally with each country that is involved. So in this particular situation, I think the courts need to have a very big role to play, because if we lose the Arctic, we're doomed. That completely undoes the entire thing that we have done for 30 years under COP and UNFCCC. We're gone. Nothing that, these 500 gigawatts, megawatts of renewable energy, none of this will matter at that point.
No, I think certainly I'm just thinking then what is the way forward? Because there's another aspect to it that while I'm questioning that, what we are doing and what is our global diplomacy policies to push something this important to us, there are so many issues back at home. So, how do you kind of balance it out with international cooperations, collaborations, and platforms and discussions, and then actually solving issues back at home, which of course we are seeing increasing number of climate induced disasters and whatnot. So just makes me wonder then what is the way forward and where do we find that balance?
uh, there is no balance to be found. Basically, what needs to be done is, so there are two measures in climate, right? One is mitigation and the other one is adaptation. Adaptation means that one way of looking at adaptation policy is that we've given up on mitigation. Mitigation nahi hoga. We can't save climate change. So now what we can do is we can just try to protect ourselves from the implications of climate change. That is adaptation. Mitigation is we still have a chance. Let's focus our energies on making sure that we can save the planet so that we don't have to adapt. Both of these need to be done in tangent. What we have done, unfortunately, in India is that we've taken a stance that is more towards adaptation, which is a very defeatist attitude, in my opinion, which is to say, you've accepted that you've lost the game, the battle, which is why you are now readying your troops to figure out how to take shield and how to survive because you've lost the battle. That's what you've done. India needs to be where China is today. Can you imagine 10 years ago, we used to tell the world used to say, oh, point fingers at China, you are the bad guys, you have done this. Today, China is leading, especially in absence of the United States under Donald Trump, the entire agenda on climate. They have cleaned up their cities, they have reduced their emissions, they are leading the charge the way forward, and they're doing it not because of the goodness of their hearts. They have recognized that there is an economic cost to their businesses and supply chains, global supply chains, because of climate. We need to come down to that reality. And while you're doing adaptation, I'm not saying don't do adaptation. All I'm saying is mitigation cannot be something that you have decided to forego. That would be my sort of kind of short answer to your question.
No, no, absolutely. That's a very valid point. I think both has to definitely go hand in hand. Um, Coming back to some of the major events that has happened in India and that has influenced the laws and policies as we know today. One such event, and I think certainly my generation would remember because we saw so many stories about it, the Bhopal gas tragedy, which was also a wake up call for our country, which prompted the introduction of the Environment Protection Act 1986, India's first comprehensive environmental legislation. Despite tougher controls under several such acts and guidelines, the number of industrial hazards and accidents in India continue to remain high. There is no denying, I think, there. Do you think these acts and laws again are strong enough to prevent such accidents? Because that makes me always question the enforcement part of it. And given that we are growing in terms of scale, technologies, innovation, we've gone through a huge shift in these regards. Don't we need to review the existing laws to see if we are sort of taking into account every important aspect, so that we are protecting the rights and of course the nature and environment.
Uh, this again goes back to the answer that I gave to you in the beginning of this chat today. I think we should be more worried about the reviews and the amendments to our acts rather than what the acts contained. If we are able to just enforce what the acts contained, I think we'd be far better off than where we are today. So, you brought out the point of the pollution cases. So I started my legal career being a junior counsel for Mr. MC Mehta many years ago. And when I was in law school, there is often this case that is being taught to everybody who's gone to law school in India, which is the Vellore Tanneries case. It's one of the landmark judgments that was led by the great Mr. MC Mehta. And under this case, there was a polluting tannery industry in Vellore. They made sure to pollute every canal, water body, groundwater, so on and so forth. And then the Supreme Court said, sorry, we're going to basically put a ban on you. You have to shut shop. This was a case that I studied when I was in law school. This is a case from the 80s, I believe. I went to college, to law school in India in 2010. And I joined Mr. MC Mehta. The first time that I joined him as an intern in 2011 or 2012. For the first time, I saw how bad enforcement is. First, as a child, imagine you've gone to law school and you read about these ideals of lawmaking and enforcement and so on and so forth, right? This is my personal account of legal education and legal enforcement in India. That case that I used to read about in my course of environmental law and right to life and whatever else classes I was taking, um, and now I'm some 20 something year old. The case came back to Mr. MC Mehta for enforcement, that the judgment had been passed but the enforcement had not been carried out. So some 20-30 years later, the same lawyer who had originally passed the gotten the case a judgment had been requested to come back to file a petition before the court for non enforcement. And this was me after having gone through my whatever class, environmental class or public constitutional law class, whatever class that was in which I was taught that. It was mind boggling for me that this is the case that my parents would have read about. This is the case, generations before me would have read of. This is the case I am reading. And now today I have come back and this case is being spoken of for a petition in the court for non enforcement, non compliance. So that is where India's enforcement is. You could be the Supreme Court, your judgments will not be enforced. And if your judges are enforced, there is no mechanism of making sure that after you have shut shop from a place, that the person is not going back again and saying, "Acha, police chali gayi, now I can come back and do my business again." Nothing, none of that exists. And that is also a virtue of the fact that we are 1.5 billion people with hundreds of cases that are yet to be decided upon, that have been going on, like these movies, Bollywood movies that have been made on cases in India where people have died and judgments are yet to are still pending. So that is the reality of India. So I don't think the question is about reviews and updating acts like Environment Protection Act in India of 1986 or whatever. The simple crux of the matter is, can you enforce it? Can you enforce judgments? Can you enforce law? The other thing that I want to come to is particularly for polluting industry. Polluting in industry in India, according to law, has to be given something called as EIA clearance or EIA certificate, which is Environmental Impact Assessment Certificate. They conduct an assessment, they look at what your impact on the environment will be. Based on that impact, you will either be given a license to operate or not. The problem is not with the law, because the law has prescribed this. The problem is, what do you mean by this much impact is okay and this much is not? That changes with governments. So we have seen that in the last few years, more and more polluting industry has been given certificates to operate businesses, even though they are highly polluting industry. They are being given those, they're being promoted because you want to create jobs, you want to create livelihoods. But if I were to look at it purely from the lens of environmental protection, and have you been following the law of EIA, which was developed for a reason, then no, it depends on who is in power and how they define what means bad and what means good, right? So there is too much. This is where political will comes to be. There is no incentive structure for me as the government to want to control polluting industry. My people are fine. I was reading the news again about Diwali, that there were a bunch of people who went in front of a AQ monitor here in Delhi, an air quality monitor here in Delhi, and started bursting the firecracker under it to see if they could, reach 999 AQI. It is us. It is incumbent upon us, the citizens of India, the residents of this country. We need to recognize this land is ours. If we treat it like, oh, किसी और की problem है, so this will never get solved. Because what we need to understand is, if somebody else is polluting Delhi, I will eventually die. It's not their problem, it is our problem. And once the government is aware of the fact that this is a political issue, it is a voter issue, you see differences. So political will is always going to be built bottom up, not top down. The government is not going to make any changes because it knows that it is good for you. You need to know what is good for you, for you to be able to ask the government, you better do this. They are public servants, they are here to serve us, not the other way around.
Absolutely. And to that point, what what I have in mind is awareness, accountability, and to some degree, all of this comes from citizen activism. The protest, and then how aware they are to kind of use their rights, because laws तो है, ऐसा नहीं कि laws completely है नहीं. तो अगर है तो उसको कैसे यूज करें. और एंड वी आर सीइंग इवेंट्स ऑफ how these public protests and activism within the constitutional rights, how they are being treated with heavy hand. So where do we go from here? How do we sort of lead the fight against some of these, even if it is to check enforcement, hold accountability, ask for accountability. So, how do we go from here? So, I think that sort of certainly brings me to another historical event that we have seen, the Chipko movement. We had this powerful slogan, cut me down before you cut down the tree. And it has led to landmark decisions. We saw the formation of one Nigam. So even after decades of protesting, large scale deforestation is happening. We are seeing several cases where illegal cutting down of trees and things like that is happening. There are some public protests as well. Some have come to light with Save Are campaigns, and it has struggled to curb the tide as well. Because, like I just said, that how we are dealing with some of these things is also a question. So, how do we strengthen, or how do we work around the citizen awareness to raise the bar in the implementation of these laws? I think that is certainly one way to look at it.
That's a great question, Arpita. And one very boring answer I have for that great question is, include law in your school education, CBSE, ICSE, whatever boards are applying in India.
I'm completely with you on this.
100%. I think, if I hadn't gone to law school, I would have never realized the basic rights that I have, even though I have gone to, the best schools in the country and, done the whole jazz. If you don't know law, and a lot of my friends from school who did not go to law school, for example, are completely unaware. So it should not be that I should only be aware of my laws or my rights and duties as a citizen just because I went to law school. It should be something that should be taught in school. So you bring about the discussion about Chipko movement, for example. It was one of the greatest movements ever led, right? 1975 redefined the forest code of India. We brought the Forest Conservation Act of India in 1980, and it completely redefined what we knew, to be India's uh, conservation sort of movement, bottom to the top, bottom up movements, right? What I was saying in the question, before you just 2 minutes ago when you asked me, the question about are these laws enough? Do they need to be upgraded, or do we need to review them? Um, and like I said to that question, my answer is going to be the same for this one as well. We should be more worried about how these laws are being currently amended rather than trying to review them to make them better and upgrade them for the current situation in 2025. Because the reality is, we have not been able to achieve what the law intended back in the day today. So upgrading it to say, to the levels of what we would need in 2030 is a fait accompli. So if we just are able to do what the law said to do, 20 years ago, we'd be better off. And a great example of this from the Chipko movement is the Forest Amendment Bill that was brought about in the Parliament in 2023. Now, in this particular amendment, Conservation Amendment Bill of 2023, which was 2 years ago, if you see the changes, that will give you a very interesting insight into how the government thinks about environmental litigations, environmental law, legislations in India. What they did was they basically had the original bill that they had passed, the 1980 bill, which is now the act technically. The Act of 1980 was passed by the parliament to limit any infrastructure development on forest land, basically to protect the forest. What the 2023 bill proposed to do was it basically gave an immense amount of power to the central government. It had a very strong centralization or centralizing power that it held with the government, the state government. What they decided to do was they said that we are going to exempt certain types of lands and forest lands and make them outside the purview of the Forest Act. And those lands were basically lands that were along the roads, the highways, the railways, lands that were meant for national security, for defense, so on and so forth. And they also added something like that the bill also said that the central government has the authority to issue directions for the implementation of the act to any authority recognized by center, state, and union territory. So your one nigam essentially becomes redundant. So I could say, as the central government, actually, I think, the power ministry should determine what to do with environmental land, or Ministry of Coal should determine what to do with the forest land. That's what they did. Then the other thing that they did was they also said that the state government or any authority that needed permission to lease the land, forest land pay, you can do lots of things, right? They said earlier in the act, in the 1980 act, there was a procedure that was prescribed of leasing. The central government in the act, in the amendment bill of 2023, said, sorry, no leasing, no business, nothing doing. We are going to determine how we give the land out. So if I am someone very powerful in the government and I really like my friend who tends to own coal mines, then I'll tell my friend, write a petition. I'm the government. I will give you authority by law. So, what we have done is we have institutionally weakened our existing law. You are talking about upgrading them, I am talking about preserving them. We will only get better if we are able to at least meet status quo. I'm saying we are not even meeting status quo. In fact, if anything, we are degrading ourselves. And then, thankfully, in 2024, the Supreme Court comes to our rescue. So, in 2024, February last year, they came to it was a bench led by the Chief Justice, the then Chief Justice himself, Chief Justice Chandrachud, where he said that he directed the government to a comply with the definition of the 1996 Govardhan judgment, which is a landmark judgment which defined what a forest area is. And additionally, it said it should also include the general definition, the general dictionary meaning of a forest. So it should not only comply with the judgment which recognizes forests, there is an inventory of forests done, it should recognize that. So the Chief Justice of India has directed the government that, sorry, this bill is wrong, unconstitutional, it is not all encompassing, the earlier law is all encompassing, so you follow the earlier law, plus you include the forests that were directed under the Govardhan judgment and any dictionary meaning of a forest. Meaning that if, my backyard had some very old forest and I had a huge backyard. Now, obviously, the government of India cannot recognize my backyard as a forest, but technically it's a forest because I own acres of land. Then even that private forest should be treated. Obviously, the rights and obligations are going to be different, but even that, which is a general dictionary definition of a forest, should be treated under the same old act. This is where we are today. This is exactly where we are today. And the Govardhan judgment also spoke about the need for the government of India to basically um, conduct some sort of an inventory of what are the forests, where are the forests, where are they located, how many trees are there, the details of it, so on and so forth. And when this bill was being developed, there is a joint parliamentary committee that was set up. And in fact, in fact, the central government even went to before the joint parliamentary committee when the bill was being discussed and agreed upon, to say we have conducted the inventory. Later in a PIL, it was found out as an official response to the PIL, it was found out that the inventory was never conducted because the government was not able to give an answer to the PIL, because the PIL petitioner asked for the inventory of the forest and they said they didn't hold any such records. So my problem is, forget upgrading, just do what the law said 30 years ago, 40 years ago, just do that much.
Back in school, we learned that the ozone hole was expanding. But thanks to the Montreal Protocol, worldwide action successfully phased out ozone depleting CFCs, demonstrating that international cooperation can reverse environmental degradation. Now, we are witnessing relatively complex carbons such as methane increasingly posing a more severe threat to the delicate balance. How can we recreate the success of the ozone treaty in combating these more serious pollutants? Because India is the third largest emitter when it comes to methane. What are we doing as a country to address this issue, and what guidelines, policies we have around methane?
The point that you have raised about methane is a very important one, and one a pertinent one in the Indian context as well. So, very simply put, if carbon dioxide, one unit of carbon dioxide produces 1 unit of global warming, on a 20-year scale, methane produces 84 times more global warming than CO2 for the same amount of gas released. That is the difference between that. So, in some sense, you can say that on a shorter time scale, and the reason that shorter time scale is such an important parameter to discuss here is because, when temperatures touch 50 degrees, that doesn't happen over 100 years. That happens now. So, in the near term, non carbon dioxide emittents or gases like methane is going to be 80 times more or 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in trapping heat. So, if India does not work on non CO2 emissions, uh, we are going to experience the brunt of the problem, because non CO2 is going to completely reverse any development, social development, or development as we know it otherwise in India. And it sort of goes back to the most fundamental question of um, environment for the sake of environment, or environment because you have realistic problem lying ahead of you, and the former is true. So when you have methane in the atmosphere, which we do, we are the third largest methane emitting country in the world, and most of our methane emissions come from the agricultural sector. And as you know, agricultural sector in India is highly informal, unorganized sector, with the daily wage laborer working there. The cattle, the dairy emissions are coming from the agricultural sector. You have rice that we grow, so on and so forth, right? If you do not curb your methane emissions for India, and I'm going to get in quickly in a second how and what and why. But generally speaking, if India does not reduce its methane emissions or non CO2 emissions, we are in for a serious trouble. And we are in for a serious trouble because the way methane manifests in India is in the form of exceedingly high temperature, meaning temperatures that are able to now test levels of human survivability. To what extent can we push the mercury higher and higher before people just fall dead to the ground? That is what methane is. So curbing methane does not just mean that, oh, I'm going to save people from falling dead to the ground because it's 60 degrees centigrade outside. It also means direct productivity. So your rickshaw wala, your sabzi wala, your ready wala, your school, everybody, how do they participate in an economy in a more productive way? If you are a company, you're an Apple or a Tesla or whoever you are, and like government of India is trying to incentivize you to come to India to make investments, you come and make investments in India, but your labor cost has gone up because everybody is falling sick. How do you work the economics of it, right? And at some point we also have labor laws that protect our labor. So it's all in contravention to one another, and that is where the problem lies. Methane needs to be tackled. Now, you spoke about the Montreal Protocol. It's a great example. And Montreal Protocol is the only treaty in the world, not climate treaty, the only treaty in the world that has been successful in attaining its goal. The only treaty in the world. The original goal that the Montreal Protocol was set out to achieve was that there was an ozone hole. Ozone hole is bad for health because it causes cancer. We, as all countries around the world, needed to close our emissions of CFCs, which is chlorofluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, HCFCs, CFCs, to reduce the size of the ozone hole and eventually have it heal completely, which it is on the path to doing and attaining it by mid-century. How did that happen? Firstly, it is the only treaty apart from the UN Charter that all countries are members to. It is also, again, the only treaty in the world that has successfully accomplished its goal. Third, it was developed on the basis of a common law principle called CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. The common responsibility is we need to protect the ozone layer. Differentiated responsibility means the world consists of different types of countries that are economically better off, that are really poor, that are sort of kind of growing. We don't know, right? So the world was divided into two categories: the developing countries and the developed countries. And the CBDR principle said, which is what the Montreal Protocol implemented and followed through, was developed countries go first because you have access to more R&D resources, you have generally more money, the consumers in your countries are not going to be that price sensitive compared to, say, an India or an African country, right? You go first, you develop the R&D, and you make the market transition out, and then you finance through something called as the MLF, multilateral fund of the Montreal Protocol, to make sure that the developing countries get facilitation, financial facilitation, to move away from CFCs and HCFCs. That is the reason that Montreal Protocol succeeded. The second reason that the Montreal Protocol succeeded was it is a sector. The Montreal Protocol works in the sector of gases, refrigerant gases, or foam gases, which is a highly organized sector. You have to know it's a sector of skill. I can't go make CFCs. I have to have a factory. And India has 5 factories in total that used to make CFCs, HCFCs. When you have to deal with a formal sector, a smaller sector, and a specialized sector, implementation and enforcement is better. That's why Montreal Protocol succeeded. Now, coming to methane and the global methane pledge, there is a it's a double-edged sword. If you go ahead and sign the global methane pledge, let's say, and your intention is to protect the earth from methane gas, which is a very important thing that one needs to do, no doubt about it. But if you sign the global methane pledge in its current form, you are signing on the responsibility and the ownership to make sure that your informal sector, that consists of 60 to 70% of 1.4 billion people, changes their rice growing practice. In India, cultivation is a traditional practice that is being passed on generation to generation. Cattle, how do you account for stray cattle? Are you telling me the government is going to take on the responsibility? You are taking the ownership and the responsibility to fix this. This is what you're signing on for. Similarly, the corresponding reality is that methane emissions, 50% of the methane emissions globally come from oil and gas sector. That is a formalized sector, specialized sector that can be tamed. So if I were to say, how would one implement a global methane pledge in from the perspective of developing countries, it should be on the same basis that the Montreal Protocol was developed, which is CBDR. Common responsibility to reduce methane emissions, differentiated in its approach and responsibility, which is oil and gas. So America is one of the countries that proposed the development. It's the co-founder, so to say, with European Union of the global methane pledge. America is also the country under the Democrats, not under Donald Trump, that reached 13 million barrels of oil per day production, which is the highest in recorded human history. So if you're so concerned about methane emissions, cut methane emissions from oil and gas sector. You're anyway promoting renewables, right? Now, talking to Trump is a different thing. But under the Democratic Party, if you are the president that wanted the global methane pledge, why are you the president that also promoted 13 million barrels of oil per day? So again, contradiction of realities and approaches. You cannot have oil and gas emissions go to 50% of global methane emissions and then tell countries like India you should stop growing rice because your rice is causing methane and that hence killing all of us. Sorry. So if you want to do methane, let's do it the just way, the most equitable way, which is you reduce your oil and gas consumption, you reduce your oil and gas production, and then to the very end, we will come to rice and cattle. That should be the last on that list of hierarchy. That if you don't follow that, this will never happen. It's not equal. It's not just.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point and approach. But what are we doing? I mean, we know that this problem exists. We are the third largest methane emitter. Uh, Given that we are going to see how we are contributing and what initiatives we are putting and the global commitments and all of that, but back at home, very plain simple, what are we really doing about it? Because I see several reports. We have figured from where these methane emissions are coming. We know the agricultural cattle problem and all of that. We know that it's informal, it's traditional practices. But we also hear so much is happening to bring technology into agriculture. There are policies that we are thinking of and whatnot. So, what exactly and how we are moving forward on this is also very important.
So, methane in India is not a gas that the government of India is not directly tackling or does not have policies to tackle. So, to give you an example, for instance, um, So for methane emissions from paddy cultivation, rice, it's not that the government of India does not have rules and policies around it. So it clearly states, and if you see the new biennial update report, the fourth biennial update report, there's a table in which it, in fact, tells you what is the gas that they're targeting, what is the policy, and how do they intend on implementing the policy. The policy, for example, for rice says that we are going to adopt something called as alternate wetting and drying. So methane emissions from rice are caused when you flood your rice fields. So it's an anaerobic bacteria that it's a chemical reaction of anaerobic bacteria that produces methane. That's how it is done, and it is anaerobic because it's underwater. So if you reduce the water quantity that you are using when you are growing rice, then it automatically solves for methane emissions, which is what alternate wetting and drying is. The second technology that it talks about is DSR, direct seeded rice, which is that you change the way in which you plant your paddy fields, and you have, as a result of that cultivation practice that you're changing, you reduce methane emissions. Similarly, you have a system of rice intensification. So you have these three very clear parameters. It's not that the policy doesn't exist. Again, we fail on enforcement. Now, I'm a Punjabi. I come from Punjab, and I know that my state grows rice. My state goes and 12% or 12 to 15% of all of rice production in India. It is much smaller in size compared to some other rice growing states of India in the southern parts of the country. I am also aware that Punjab is the only state in Punjab and Haryana, or the northern states in India, are also the two states that are critically short of water, groundwater. Why is it that my farmer is growing rice? It's not that my farmer is crazy and my farmer doesn't know what he or she is doing. They are forced to grow rice. And they're forced to grow rice because you have an MSP that is reflective of rice and wheat. And now MSP is a central government policy, which is true for rice and wheat all over the country. The difference is procurement in Punjab and Haryana happen for rice and wheat. So as a result of it, it's a financial incentive problem. I am incentivized, and by the virtue of that incentivization, forced to grow rice. But if I were the central government and if I wanted to take a step back and I really wanted to solve this problem, I cannot solve this problem by saying do AWD, DSR, or SRI. That's just words. If you really want to see change on ground, you need to take a step back and say, okay, how many quintals, tons of millions of quintals of rice do I need? What are the states that can grow it without artificial intelligence, irrigation, which is like, you're actually artificially irrigating your fields using canal or whatever, groundwater, and you're also subsidizing them. Electricity subsidization has happened so that you can put these pumps and suck out all the water from the ground as much as you want to, so that you can irrigate your paddy fields, and then those paddy fields will be procured because rice is being procured under MSP, and life is great, right? So if I were the central government, I would have taken a step back and looked at what are the states, and the answer is southern states. Southern and eastern belt of India can actually grow rice naturally because it gets flooded. And when it gets flooded, it can produce rice. And then incentivize those. For Punjab and Haryana, where there is no water, I should have incentivized the farmer to grow other things, pulses, fruits, vegetables. But I can only do a lip service by saying, "Oh, please don't grow rice. Please grow rice. Grow fruit and vegetable." But I will not, because if I want to make money after a year's work, I need the government to give me a guarantee that you're going to procure my produce. Currently, the government is only procuring the produce of rice and wheat. So it's a mismatch of subsidy, resubsidization, intent, and politics.
That brings me to another complex issue of plastics. You know, it's not a news anymore what plastic is doing to the environment. And we have seen several recommendations, guidelines on banning single use plastic, discouraging plastic usage. Even when it comes to waste management, there are guidelines. But why is it so difficult to do away with plastic despite several attempts, campaigns in place? And sadly, we are also seeing a time where some of, or rather, one leader we all can, think of, who has announced to go back to plastic. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so talking about India first and foremost, it was Eric Solheim, who was the former executive
Yeah.
director of UNEP, the UN Environment Program, who had on a mission to India, met with the Prime Minister, and they both jointly agreed that India is going to go into a plastic ban, single-use plastic ban, and in 2022, we actually went into banning single-use plastic, which is a great accomplishment for India. Now, coming to other plastics. So, the plastics are also divided in different grades. There is a high grade plastic, low grade plastic, and very low grade plastic, right? Single use plastics, or SUPs, as we call them, fall under the category of what was being extremely wasteful. That sort of plastic you can't recycle. So, you put a ban on it. Now, if you've seen, when there is a kabadi wala who comes home to take, your refuse of waste and metal, that entire industry gets recycled. That kabadi wala's job is to procure that high valued, better grade plastic from households and put it through recycling. So that does get recycled, and eventually it gets pelletized, and it is being sold at different rates. And those pellets are now being used as a coal substitute in power plants in India. So that's happening. Talking about plastic as an industry, one must realize, when we think of plastic, we think about lifafas, the polythene bags. Plastic is also an extremely important chemical that is made through the oil and gas industry. Plastic is made through hydrocarbons, and it is used in a plethora of applications. So, getting rid of plastic generally in the current form of the world that we live in is not entirely possible. Is it possible for certain sectors? Yes. Is recycling an option? Yes. um, if you were to ask me, in its lifetime, do you actually get rid of plastic? No. Is it truly good? No. But can you do without it is also a no. And then the other things that make the challenge of getting rid of plastic extremely difficult in India is the plastic lobby. If you are a hydrocarbon producer, or a refinery that does oil and gas, refining, or you are a company that deals with plastic manufacturing, it's a huge industry lobby. So you can't just suddenly shut shop on them. That's where you get into trouble. Also, medical
Absolutely.
industry
Yeah.
uses plastic.
Yeah.
So
No, I
that's
think
a debated one.
certainly it's difficult because while I think to some degree certainly agree that we cannot completely do away with every grade of plastic, but certainly certain grades of plastic we should and we can. But it is also about how are we supporting the industry when we are asking them to do away with a certain something that they've been using for such a long time. It's part of the entire value chain, and that means cost to business. And we are not talking about big businesses, we are talking about MSMEs, the smaller businesses. So I think that is another aspect to look at very closely, that if we are moving towards a direction where we are putting a ban on single use plastic, we are also closely following up on that ban. But how are we supporting the industries? Because I think there is some gap there, and I think that probably should help, at least in terms of ensuring that the ban that we have put is actually being met. So that probably will be one part of the answer to this problem. um in the spirit of in its spirit, laws and national missions can only yield impact when communities come together in a collective action and conscious. The real impact lies in the local solutions tailored to each region's unique issues. Now we have NAPCC, SAPCC already in place, and there are district level climate action plans also now emerging. We have seen cities like Ahmedabad, Bhopal, Nagpur, for that matter, coming up with their climate action plans. How can community engagement drive these goals forward? And most importantly, for residents across cities, districts, villages, how can they push for and contribute to the development and execution of these plans? Because drawing up plans is something that we can do. I think we have completely agreed in this entire conversation. It is the implementation and the enforcement that is where the challenge lies. So how do we bring these two sort of stakeholders together to work on this?
The one case study that comes to my mind is the Good Samaritan law. There are a lot of Western countries and Western societies follow, right? And usually these Good Samaritan laws are enforced for public safety, community safety. You have the night watch, you have the neighborhood watch, and all of these concepts, right? Which is to basically say, we have eyes on the roads, and if there is a stranger out there, we are going to, call the cops. So we're going to alert the authorities, whatever it is. I think some form of the Good Samaritan law concept, which was originally intended for the purposes of just general security, that should be adopted in the enforcement of these things. Now obviously there is a problem there because morality versus law happens, and what might be right for me might not be right for you. But if the law is defined very clearly and very clear instructions are given to a community of people who want to volunteer to help make sure that a certain area, protected area, is preserved, and there is no illegal felling of trees, for example, you can implement the concept of that neighborhood watch in these particular segments. So I think someone on the government side, or at the state level, needs to really take a step back and be like, okay, what are these concepts that I can replicate for these situations and for this sort of enforcement? So yeah, Good Samaritan law, neighborhood watch, things like these, if they are implemented in the right form in India for the protection and preservation of the general environment and climate, like we say, don't throw garbage on the roads. If you had, a bunch of retired uncles and aunties create this sort of committee, neighborhood committee, and we've seen that in RWAs in Delhi, zero waste RWAs in Delhi. If you could do the same in India for every RWA, every neighborhood, every district, that's what you that's what you need, and there is no other enforcement better than that, because that is then ownership of the person of saying, this neighborhood is mine, you're not going to throw trash on the side of the road because it's public nuisance. So yeah.
Why can't we do this when it comes to air pollution? मतलब आप देखो, दिल्ली का air pollution is news everywhere and we live it every year. And today I'm sitting and saying this कि अब this is not news anymore. This is my house. My parents suffering from certain conditions where on prescription the doctor has actually told me, या तो आप अपने पेरेंट्स को 6 महीने के लिए 5 महीने के लिए बाहर लेकर जाइए क्योंकि उनके लंग्स अब जवाब दे रहे हैं. सो इट्स नो मोर ओ मैंने न्यूज में देखा. एंड आई एम स्टिल सेइंग दैट it is still a fraction of people who actually want to do something about this. कुछ RWAs करेंगे, कुछ सोसाइटीज करेंगे, बच्चों को देख के परेशान होके समथिंग समथिंग वी आर डूइंग, बट I still don't see a strong community action coming for important issues like these.
So community actions on something that is tangible is easier to enforce. If I can see somebody is throwing garbage on the side of the road, I can tell the person, please don't do this. एयर पोल्यूशन उस कॉन्सेप्ट पे काम ही नहीं करता. It's intangible, right? You can't see it. You can't see an air pollution. And the sources of air pollution are not sources that you can curb. So let's talk about Delhi. About 40% of Delhi's air pollution comes from transport sector. Now, as residents of Delhi, we are forced to sell our diesel cars at 10 years, even though हमारा vehicle usage कुछ भी ना क्यों ना हो. But the law says आपको 10 साल के बाद आपको अपनी गाड़ी बेचनी पड़ेगी. And if it is a petrol car, it has to be sold off or be done with, within 15 years of its lifetime. So the government of Delhi has put a law that forces you and I to sell my diesel and petrol cars at 10 and 15 years respectively. What it does not account for is the more than a million cars that enter and exit Delhi twice a day in the state because people are coming here for jobs, work, so on and so forth, or passing through the state. So you are unfairly burdening me, resident of Delhi, so that a million cars can come pass by. They're not stopping you on the Delhi border checkpoint and saying, sorry, 15 साल पुरानी गाड़ी है, UP number plate, नहीं जा सकती. You can't do it. So our problem is residents welfare association, or this good Samaritan law, or people who are volunteering. You can't enforce air pollution. Air pollution is sort of above our pay grade, so to say. That is not something that you and I can do. That is something the government has to do. Because when you are enforcing law, you have to take into take into consideration the reality of the place. So Delhi में आपने इंडस्ट्री बंद कर दी, सोनीपत में तो है. The wind blows from Sonipat to Delhi. So if the chimney stacks in Sonipat are emitting gunk, they're going to come to Delhi through the wind. And what happens is we are looking at air pollution using state boundaries as a concept कि हम दिल्ली में ये करेंगे. Air does not recognize state boundaries. कि मैं दिल्ली के ऊपर वाली हवा हूं तो मैं साफ हूं, मैं यूपी के ऊपर वाला हूं तो मैं गंदा हूं, मैं पंजाब के ऊपर वाला हूं तो मैं गंदा हूं. Doesn't work like that. It moves, it flows. So when you have to enforce policy for air pollution, it has to be done in an airshed. An airshed is basically a concept, it's a geographical area which is defined with a similar kind of temperature, weather. So for example, अगर दिल्ली में बारिश हो रही है तो सोनीपत पानीपत में भी क्लाउडी या बारिश तो हो रही होगी, चंडीगढ़ तक भी होएगा. So you are creating an entire geographical area across different states. गाजियाबाद में भी होगी, which is UP. नोएडा में भी होगी, which is UP. So you're creating across 3 states an airshed. That's what an airshed is. India needs to implement airsheds for air quality. It cannot do it using state boundaries. The other thing that we have done in Delhi is GRAP. GRAP आता है, GRAP चला जाता है.
You think it is I don't know, I don't see a lot of impact from GRAP. लगता है चला जाता है फिर बीच में आता है, लेकिन मैं तो उतने ही हवे और AQI में रह रही होती हूँ.
GRAP is, you and I are women. Every woman, when they have their period, they get cramps, right? Then what do we do when we get cramps? We'll either use a hot water bottle or we'll use a Meftas.
Yeah, it's a banded solution. Yeah.
लगा दो. लेकिन नीचे कुछ हील हो रहा है कि नहीं, किसी को फर्क नहीं पड़ता. GRAP is that. Second of all, GRAP does not take into consideration the bulk of emissions. ट्रांसपोर्ट का क्या कर रहे हो आप ग्रैप के टाइम पे? कुछ नहीं कर रहे हो. वेस्ट बर्निंग इज आउटसाइड द पर्व्यू ऑफ ग्रैप. What are you controlling under GRAP? You're controlling under GRAP PM10, which is dust. You're not controlling under GRAP 2.5. And again, what will GRAP do if the air comes from Punjab, Haryana and wherever else?
Exactly. आप कंस्ट्रक्शंस भी बंद कर रहे हो. कंस्ट्रक्शन जो बॉर्डर के अराउंड हो रही है और हर जगह ही हो रही है.
There is a very
I know.
हो रही थी, वो बोल रहे थे जज कि आप बंद कराइए, मैं कंस्ट्रक्शन बंद करा दो. The state council said, sir,
Irony died a slow death.
कर दो.
I'll come to my last piece of this discussion, which is I completely understand that not everyone can be a full-time activist, and At the same time, I also feel that every individual still has a role to play in protecting the environment. It is no more कि सरकार देख लेगी, companies देख लेगी, ये देख लेगा, वो देख लेगा. अब तो करना है, सबको कुछ करना है. Now, we have spoken about laws, हैं laws, enforcement में problem है, चलो हम वो भी देखेंगे. We have spoken about awareness, we have spoken about a lot of things. Can you leave our listeners with some practical suggestions, tips about how to go about it? So if I am facing any environmental issues, I'm seeing something happening in my area, which I, based on very basic search, I understand ki it's illegal, and there is a fair chance that I can fight it out. Where do I go? Where do I start from?
I think the simplest answer to that question is rage. India has a lot of rage. India's rage comes out in very funny places. कि आपने हॉर्न बजा दी तो लोग गाड़ी से निकल के आपको बंदूक दिखाएंगे. अगर आपको यही करना है तो आप एयर पोल्यूशन के लिए क्यों नहीं करते हो? You tell me, Arpita, if tomorrow, all women who have kids, whose kids are not able to go out and play because the AQI is horrible, you're basically giving your child asthma or cancer or God knows what all. Tell me a situation if all women, if Delhi did not get out to the streets to say, we will not let you run state machinery if you do not clean air today. Tell me. You tell me. Can the
My
government
answer to
work?
that is that if women actually come out on the street and because they feel what their kids are going through, I also bring the point that have women in leadership. I think we will start seeing a lot of change even then, and
It
not
was a
not for
female
namesake.
minister. I disagree with you. It was a female minister, member of parliament, who told the government in response to a question that was asked in the parliament, which was about air pollution related deaths in India. It was a woman who made a statement in the parliament saying that air pollution does not cause deaths. Gender has nothing to do with air pollution. In fact, the reason I'm saying women is because, unfortunately or fortunately, women are the primary child caregiver. So, banking on the fact that women are going to enter politics and somehow going to change environment is going to somehow be directly proportional to the amount of female representation in the parliament does not hold true. So, what we need to actually do is we need to make environment clean air a political issue. Till the time it does not feature in a political manifesto, you can forget about it. You can forget about it. You can complain about it. Aunties and uncles will go and talk about it in the park in the morning, and they'll do laughing therapy after that and inhale 2.5 more. That is the reality of it. If you do not want it and you do not stop machinery, you do not protest, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, what happens with the female security in India, we saw this tragedy in Calcutta. How many rape cases happen in India? Several. Unfortunate reality of India. But why was it that the Calcutta rape case was tried on the speediest basis, on priority? It was because the entire medical fraternity across India came out with their hands up in the air saying, we will stop going to hospitals, do what you can. Get hold of this guy. You need to put pressure on the government. The government is not going to do anything out of the goodness of their heart. There is no government and there is no goodness of heart. It works on reaction, public reaction. If you do not have public reaction, if you do not exercise your right to protest, you're going to be taken for a ride, which is what's been happening.
No, I think certainly protest, uh, community action, individual accountability, all of this is a very important part of the discussion now. And I think there is absolutely no room left कि कोई देख लेगा. नहीं, कोई नहीं देखेगा, हमें देखना पड़ेगा, हमें पूछना पड़ेगा. Thank you so much. I truly hope, I mean, I enjoyed this conversation and I truly hope that we have left our listeners with some understanding of laws in India, some inspiration from successful campaigning that has happened in the past, that we can still take charge. We just need to be more aware. We need to just take action, and that action starts from me. Doesn't start कि 10 लोग इकट्ठा होंगे तो मैं भी जाके join कर लूंगी. It has to start from me. So I truly hope that we have left them with this message. Before closing, I'm just going to ask you one last message that you would like to give to the youth, to the people uh, who care about climate and who do not care about climate yet and should care for climate.
I think my message is going to be based on different age groups of people. To the older people, my message is think about your grandchildren. For the parents that are going to be, sending their kids to the schools, or young parents, young couples that are choosing to have kids, think about the future that you want to give to your child, your unborn child, or your child who's in school now and is not getting the same childhood that you got when you were a child. And to the younger folk, I want to say that recognize the power of speaking truthfully and asking the right questions to the government, speaking truth to power, essentially. Because if you don't, you are going to be the next generation that is going to be taken for a ride. So, the world is your oyster. If you can think it, you can do it. So, do it.
Thank you so much, Zareen. I mean,
It was a
truly
pleasure.
loved the conversation. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much for having me, Arpita.
This conversation has made one thing clear. While policies and laws exist, enforcement remains a challenge. And without citizen participation, legal frameworks alone won't solve the crisis. So, what can we do? Legal empowerment is key. Citizens must know their rights, how to report violations, hold authorities accountable, and push for stronger enforcement. We need more legal interventions and integrated climate action and economic plans, but we also need political will, stronger enforcement, and active public participation. Not everyone can be a full-time activist, but every individual has a role to play. Whether it is filing a PIL, reporting violations, or simply spreading awareness, change starts with engagement. The environment is not just a government responsibility, it's a collective fight. If you found this episode insightful, share it, talk about it, and let's continue this conversation beyond this podcast. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a greener world.